right there, like that.
There we are. Yeah, that's nice.
Good evening, chaps. We've got a great show for you tonight. We've got a very special guest today on Thursday. It's Professor Robin Milner-Gulland, a very well-known and respected scholar of Russian and Byzantine literature, culture, and art. He joined the University of Sussex as a lecturer in Russian in 1962, and he's still associated with that university in the capacity of emeritus professor. So he's had a long and accomplished career. His most recent book, Andrey Rublev, The Artist and His World, has just appeared on the market. Now you can post your highly intelligent questions in the chat, and we'll be answering them tonight. You can also join live and ask your question in person. It is a very fitting subject for this channel, which is called The Iconographer. So I would like to say thank you, Professor Milner-Gulland, for appearing tonight, for being with us.
Fine, just call me Robin. Easiest.
Now, before we talk about the book, I want my audience to get to know you a little better. So after you did your national service, you went to Oxford and you specialized in German and Russian. Why those languages? What drew you to Russian?
Well, the fact that I had done a national service Russian course drew me to Russian. And after that, I thought it had driven everything else I knew out of my mind. But of course, I did remember a few other things as well. And there's a certain sense in which that follows on from the question that you were threatening to put to me about some great important place in my life when I changed ideas. And that was back at school, when I suddenly realized I was not cut out to do Latin and Greek. The more so since a new headmaster had come in, who I reckon was a sadist and wanted to beat Greek into us. And I thought, how can I get out of this? Modern languages, obviously. So I was told the only way I could do that was by taking up German and teaching myself, which was fine. And from that, it progressed to the National Service Russian course.
I see, because of course in the 1950s you had the sort of national language policy where the government was actively, or the war rooms were recruiting people to learn Russian. And I think by 1960, 5,000 young men, they were quite fluent. Were you also groomed by that program?
Well, it was a great thing, that Russian course. You know, we were all pals, and it came to an end after a few years, but we had been taught extremely thoroughly. I thought I would never know anything again. As it happened, it was quite easy to forget a lot of the military terminology and so on. But it made one want to go on doing things within the Russian sphere that got a little bit beyond guns and tanks.
Yes, and then when you were about 24, 25, I imagine, you went to Moscow, to the State University there, and you were there for a year. What was that like?
It was great. It was one of the best years of my life. It was a scheme that had been started under Nikita Khrushchev, and it was intended to thaw out relations with Great Britain, and it included about 20 students going in each direction each year. And if you got onto that, and I found it quite easy to do so, I was a postgraduate student at Oxford by that time, and it's rather curious because we didn't fly in those days. We took a boat to Leningrad, and when we got off late at night at the harbour in Leningrad, we were allocated, you're to Leningrad, you're to Moscow. And I turned out to be going to Moscow. But it was a terrific year. I made good friends. I explored the countryside. I generally sort of opened up in life a bit.
Because I think this was in the Cold War, so a lot of people, and we'll talk about the book in a minute, but a lot of people will find this fascinating. Because going to Russia in the 60s, that at that time, of course, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, they were also in Moscow. Did you ever run into them?
We didn't know anything about those people. That all, one learned from television years later. But it was a time when I did meet some very good friends, including the poet Yevtushenko, whose work I started translating, and that came out as a very popular Penguin book. And in general, felt I had got more into the country and the city and the people than I would have done in any other way.
And this friend of yours, this poet, he's one of the most famous 20th century Russian poets.
Yes.
How did you meet him? Did you meet him in a cafe? How would these sort of meetings happen in Russia?
He gave a reading to the students at Moscow University, big lecture theatre, and I just went up to the front and handed him a note and said, I'd like to meet you. I'd already started translating some of his stuff in collaboration with the poet Peter Levy in England, who died quite a few years back. And he got in touch with me after that, because he wanted to be translated. He wanted to be known in places other than Moscow. But he wasn't the only interesting person that I met. It was a great time of sort of burgeoning culture. Things seemed to be exploding at the time.
One of the things that I valued a great deal in your book about Andrey Rublev is that you don't just draw medieval sources, but you also casually quote 19th century and 20th century poets and modern Russian culture, and that helps the readers understand the sort of the Russian culture much more deeply, and it gives a much better sense of what it is like growing up in that culture. Now, why did you decide to write a book about this artist in particular? Because he's very well known, but there's very little information, like primary sources about him. So why did you take this difficult subject?
Because a publisher asked me to. No, it's a publisher, Reaction Books, who I've cooperated with over the years for 20 years or something like that. I've translated stuff for them, and the chief bloke said to me, do you know anybody who can write on Rublev? Because we've got a series going on medieval lives. So I asked around a bit and nobody volunteered. So when lockdown happened, I said, I'll do it. I did. And the funny thing is that I had worked on that period of culture, not particularly Rublev, but quite a lot on Rublev, way back when I was a graduate student, something like 40 years before. And I hadn't thrown my notes away. And even though it was locked down, I couldn't get to libraries and so on, I had the material. So I went ahead.
Could you still read your handwriting from all those years ago?
Well, it's quite odd to read it, but I could. It wasn't all handwriting. It was other documents and things like that. And I was obviously quite an assiduous student. I was a bit surprised at the things I'd made notes of. But there it was all good. And it passed a couple of years, which otherwise might have been wasted.
Well, it is interesting. You actually mentioned or cite your supervisor at Oxford, Sir Dmitry Obolensky. You cite him saying that Rublev was the greatest Russian artist who ever lived. So was he the person who first introduced you to Rublev?
Well, he didn't first introduce me, but around that sort of time. And when I looked up Obolensky's book and found that quotation, I was quite surprised, because Obolensky was a very sort of mild-mannered man. He wasn't a great enthusiast for anything. And when he went right over the top about Rublev, I thought that was good. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing him Rublev rather than Rublev. And the curious fact is, we don't quite know how he was pronounced in his own time. But nowadays, all Russians call him Rublev. So I just slip into that form of words.
Rublev.
Yeah.
Okay, but so why did the publishers approach you with this specific artist? What makes him so distinctive and so unique among his peers?
I think Michael Lehman, my publisher at Reaction Books, simply had a good questing knowledge of the world and of intellectual history. And he probably realized there is no book in English, or there wasn't until this one, no book in English on Rublev. Everybody mentions him, but they mention him and then slide off. So he wanted something that would go a bit deeper into him. I did my best.
Well, and it is a great book. I recommend everyone who's interested in Russian medieval culture and history to go and read it, because you don't just give an overview of Rublev's life, but also of that of his world and what it was like to live in Russia, that sort of very tumultuous time with the Tatars and everything. So it's a very interesting book. Now, you mentioned that you had these notes from your student days. But what were the greatest struggles when you were writing this book, when you were researching it, putting it together? What were some key issues that you came across?
The difficulty was catching up. I mean, 40 years of scholarship, for heaven's sake, it takes some catching up. But the thing is, there has been a lot of work since my graduate student days on problems associated with Rublev. Most of the more recent work probably isn't worth reading, but you've got to look at it, otherwise you won't know what is worth reading. And I wouldn't really say that anything more recent than the 1960s has made a huge impact.
Right. Because that's one of the great things about the book. You're also synthesizing centuries of debate around an artist and sort of a lot of fevered debate in the last century, maybe specifically. So that must have been tough. So what did you leave out?
It's hard to say now what I left out, but what I put in was the film by Tarkovsky. And that really is a landmark in the studies. He was taken on by the chief Soviet film studio in Moscow in the early 1960s, and he himself was only in his 20s, to make a film on Rublev, and they didn't really know what he was going to produce. He self-identified with Rublev a lot because his name was Andrey as well. And he worked with a man who is still alive called Andrey Konchalovsky. And the two Andreys, before they ever got to filming a single shot, they spent 2 or 3 years reading up the culture and history of the period. Which is quite complicated because it was in the Tatar times. The Tatars were the rulers of Russia at the time, but their rule was not very oppressive by that stage. All they wanted was money, really, money and expertise. And so that sort of changes the picture slightly from what it had been 100 years earlier. And the fact is, Russia was reviving at that stage. How it revived, It's a little bit mysterious to me, and I've been to the top geopolitical people to try and work out why, but somehow it was getting richer. And in getting richer, it was building more buildings, some of them still surviving to the present day, and you'll find pictures of them in my book. And in general, there was the possibility of expanding the rather bleak period of history that had been 100 years or so before that. And Moscow profited by this and built churches out of white stone, by which they mean limestone. They opened up new quarries, get the limestone. They worked it very beautifully, as you'll see from the pictures in my book. And generally, the whole place seemed to be on the up, as it were.
This is very significant that because in the West we don't get taught a lot about the Tartar period, which you demarcate as from about 1240 till 1480.
Yeah.
And of course the Orthodox Church served to remind the Russians who they were, didn't it, during that time?
Absolutely, yes.
So the icons and the paintings and the other works of art that Rublev would have created, they had a special significance, I imagine. Would he have had a lot to do with the Tartars? Would they have been in his way?
If you look at Tarkovsky's film, you will see that the Tartars make quite a lot of appearances. But generally, the Tartars didn't bother so long as they were getting their payments. If they didn't, they'd come and ransack a few villages, probably quite a lot of villages. And in the end, there was a great showdown, the Battle of Kulikova, really just before Rublev's time, where the armies of the Grand Prince of Moscow confronted a Tartar army and won. It was only a Tartar army. The Tartars were splitting up at that stage, but it was a tremendous boost to morale at the time. Though one mustn't take these things too far. Nobody knew nobody within history knows what's going to happen next year, let alone in 10 years' time.
Yes, and so if we think, because I feel like, most of us in the West, we are used to this tradition of the Renaissance with we've got perspective and we've got realistic figures. And then if we look to the East, these icons, they appear a bit stiff, don't they? They're different to what we're used to. So
yeah, but the fact is, Rublev's work, so long as we can work out what he did, is much more fluid and much less stiff, I would say. The stiffness and the general sort of quality of being stereotyped comes much later. In Rublev's time, people were still working out new ways of doing things, new ways of painting, new ways of representing what were age-old biblical scenes.
So could you talk a little bit about how he would have been taught the art of painting and the art of making icons? Would he have gone to a workshop like we had in Western Europe?
Absolutely, yes. Well, you'd have to join a team. And you could join a team as a junior member who, on the whole, was mixing up colors and things like that, as you'd expect. Not too different from what happened in the early Renaissance. And
so
a senior member of it.
A team of painters would have been called a družina, I learned from your book.
That's right, družina. It means it means a group of people with a common purpose. From the word drug, meaning friend.
And so how many, if we start to think about his work as a painter, Which artworks come to mind immediately?
Which, sorry?
Which artworks come to mind? I mean, of which artworks do we know that he made them for certain?
Well, there are records of his work in 1405 and 1408. Just those two records in contemporary chronicles. Later on, we know from saints' lives how his life went on after that. But those are articles for commissions of high status, and the chroniclers actually say who was involved. Theophanes the Greek was the lead artist in the first of these commissions, and Andrey and Daniel, we don't know anything much about Daniel, except he cooperated with Andrey Rublev over many years. And they just say, and with their Druzhina and with their team. Because if you're painting a church in Russia, icons and all, wall paintings particularly, it takes time, and you only have at the most 6 months of the year to do it. You've got to move very fast. So you need a Druzhina to keep the whole thing going.
Yes, and then the other half of the year, you say they would have probably dedicated to painting icons, which would have been easy to sell, right?
Yeah, it's a bit simpler to paint icons than wall painting, because the walls, of course, they get cold and they have to dry out then in the end. But painting icons you can do in winter as well. So,
yeah,
and manuscripts.
And manuscripts. So in the second half of the 15th century, a major church figure, Saint Joseph of Volokholamsk, you wrote glowingly about him, you say in the book, and about his life.
And he was indeed a famous church figure, and we just know that he particularly valued Rublev's icons, but we don't know which ones. Rublev didn't sign anything. By the end of that century, they were beginning to sign things, but at that stage they didn't. So whether what he admired was authentic or not, we really don't know.
Presumably, he would have made loads of icons, many of which have now been lost.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. I mean, an icon is a fairly vulnerable thing. It can get burnt, of course, particularly if there are candles a bit too close to it, and woodworm. And simply people might want to replace the old icons. They wanted to replace the old icons for a quite interesting reason, that they were made all shiny at the beginning with oil, linseed oil, on the paint surface. And that linseed oil was fine for a few years, and then it started to darken. And after 50 to 100 years, it would be so dark you couldn't read the original painting on the surface. So people would take the old icon. They could scrape it down, but on the whole, they could repaint it, or they could just throw it away.
Yes, and then we'll talk about restoration in a second, but let's go to maybe, well, most definitely his most famous icon, which is the Trinity, right? This wonderful, which has just by Putin has recently moved it from the art gallery back to a church in Moscow. Can you maybe first describe this icon to the viewers, because it's pretty huge, right? It's very
well. It's not exactly huge, but it's about. I'm sitting in front of a wooden table, and it's about half the size of that, and it stood on the lowest rank of the Trinity Monastery. The word Trinity is cropping up quite a lot now. The Trinity Monastery, founded by St. Sergius, who later was taken as the patron saint of Russia, and tried to be a generally calming influence, because where you've got a lot of princes, they're going to quarrel. But Sergius was known as a man of peace and harmony. He's sort of Francis of Assisi type. and he refused to be made the patriarch and so on. Anyhow, that's by the way, but this icon was painted, as we know from later document, in memory of St. Sergius, and so as to quell the enmity between people. And how does it represent that particular aim? At first, you might find it rather difficult to say. It represents three figures, beautifully painted figures, and in glowing colors. I mean, Rublev uses ultramarine. Now, ultramarine is something quite special. It was in the early Renaissance at that time too. It had to be imported from what's now Afghanistan, from a single mountain that gave the rock that can be ground up to make ultramarine. I mean, this was no small effort, and a beautiful blood red color too. And the whole thing is haunting from that point of view. But what we have are three figures who supposedly represent the three men who appear to Abraham and Sarah in the book of Genesis. And why do these three men appear? Well, if they're angels, they are emissaries of God. They are travelers who do God's will. And it's quite interesting. You look at them, you can't tell if they're male or female, you can't tell if they're young or old. They have this nice curly hair, which is like Leonardo da Vinci quite often used. And they are sitting around a table, and the table is a chalice. And there may have been other things, but they may have been lost, who knows. But it is thought that they represent the whole of biblical history that came afterwards, really. Abraham's tent is in the background, the tree under which they feasted, because Abraham gives them a feast, and a rock. The rock's rather mysterious, but the Lord is a rock, anyhow, quite often it's used in the Old Testament. But there are all sorts of points that can be made and have been made about that icon, and it would be really superficial to start trying to summarize all of them. But the three figures are very nicely placed within a hexagon, or within a circle, or possibly within a triangle. They are, as it were, basic elements of nature, and they sort of sum up the world as it was known at the time. Anyhow, it was highly valued, this, and in the 1550s, when it was already darkening, obviously, it was mentioned as an example that icon painters should take. So it was still famous then, and rather lost sight of after that, but not totally forgotten.
One aspect that's very striking about the icon is that the painter has actually left Abraham and Sarah out of the composition.
Yes.
But then, yes.
It is quite extraordinary, that, because it's an old scheme of representation. You know, in my book, I simply choose one early representation from Ravenna, but also on Mount Sinai, you have the same scheme and so on. So it was taken, I mean, events in the Old Testament taken as symbolic of events in the New Testament. That's no mystery, and that happened in the West as well as the East. But it is quite curious that what you would think of as the really important figures get left out. And their presence, of course, is implicit, because everybody would have known the Genesis text that talks about Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham being the founder of a great nation and so on. But to concentrate just on these three messengers is a new departure.
And then you also argue that Abram and Sarah, they have been left out of the picture, but then they are represented in those elements that you've mentioned. So the pavilion represents Abram's house, and then the rock, probably the rock on which Isaac was bound by Abraham when God told him to sacrifice him. So,
yes, indeed. So they're there in the story. They're just not what we concentrate on.
Exactly. And then, so this icon, it has just been moved back to a church by Putin. Now, this is a very complex issue. I'll grant you that. But generally speaking, do you agree with this kind of thing? That, of course, paintings are safer in museums where the climate is controlled and so forth. But on the other hand, they are dead. And now this painting has sort of returned to history. It's alive again. People can pray next to it. What do you make of this move?
It's a very curious episode, and it happened after my book was published. My book was published in March or April and so on. This happened in May. I'm quite glad I didn't have to talk about it, because whatever's happening is still ongoing. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was taken to the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, the great gallery of Russian art. And clearly it had to be restored, because the paintwork on these early paintings is never very secure. It flakes, cracks happen in the wood and so on. And it was in the care of the Tretyakov restoration workshops, and eventually, fairly recently actually, it was enclosed in an air-conditioned capsule and could still be seen, obviously, because it was glass, but it wasn't just open to the elements, as it were. And then suddenly, Putin in May says, before Trinity Sunday, there's that word again, which this year happened to be the 4th of June, I shall return it to the Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of the Orthodox Church had asked to borrow it just for 2 weeks. And he's best pals with Putin, as we know. Or perhaps we don't, but we ought to know. And Putin says, no, you can have it forever. Why should he do this? Interesting question. I've been puzzling on it, and I've been reading all the documents concerned with that. The Tretyakov Gallery restorers were horrified. As you can imagine, I've read all their agendas and so on from the meetings that they then had. They didn't have long to object. And it didn't belong to Putin. It wasn't his to dispose of. It belonged to the Ministry of Culture, to be precise. And it could be, I mean, if we look at Putin, there are various ways of looking at him, and I'm not going to start arguing about that here. But if we regard him as a sort of a mafia boss, which a lot of people do, and not without reason, if he's boss, he can be in control of really important things. And this, from the church's point of view, was a really important thing. It had become very famous in the 20th century, much written about. So it actually wasn't clean till 1919. And then people saw all that we now see. But it can be that. But I think that, like most mafia bosses, he's superstitious. And the same happens in Sicily and southern Italy. I say that without huge knowledge of the Camorra and so on. But these people tend to be, in their way, very devout. They think there are higher forces that can control their destinies. I think that Putin wanted to have this icon on his side because his war was not going very well. Anyhow, it's just a thing.
Yes, but then, of course, so removing ourselves from this particular instance, so looking at it more generally, do you think that icons like these, which of course had a ceremonial use, or so very practical use within churches, do you think they are better at home in museums or in churches?
I don't know that one can absolutely generalize, but if they are in churches, and the Orthodox Church, to be fair to it, has got people who particularly look after their works of art. Sometimes they look after them better and sometimes less well, but at least there is such a department. There are constant difficulties with displaying these things, open to the elements, open to people's breathing, open to candle smoke, and they continually need to be examined and re-examined so that they won't deteriorate. Because after all, it's only a thin layer of paint on top of gesso, and that's going to start flaking off before you know what's happening. So I think they probably are better off in museums, and it's a moot point, but if they're of art historical value, I think they've got to be in museums, really, to be looked after.
Yes. You've studied the Trinity by Rublev really quite deeply. You describe it as a battle-scarred relic.
Yes.
And as sort of, when we're talking about art conservation, because we're talking about it being only like a thin layer of paint, what do you think, what would your advice be on the restoration of this painting in particular? Because, of course, these three figures, they used to have halos which were gilded.
Yes, absolutely.
That is pretty straightforward. You can
and the gilt has come off, true.
Yes.
I don't know the answer to this one. I think that the restoration workshops at the Tretyakov know what they're doing, and one's got to go along with their advice. They're going to give impartial advice according to the best practice in East and West, and that's all one can do. One has to trust them. Because obviously the Trinity icon isn't the only one. There are other ancient icons buried in the Tretyakov as well, which are being looked after. And I remember spending a whole day in the restoration workshops in the northern city of Vologda with a friend of mine who worked there once. And he pointed out that only one in every 500 icons is a masterpiece, but they all have to be very carefully examined and treated and so on. And a whole notebook about their progress has to be kept. So I think that the restorers are quite honest in this business and want to do the very best they can.
Because another thing you mentioned is that it is thought, because we can see this in other versions of this image, that there were triangular pieces of bread on the table between the three angels originally.
We don't know.
No.
There are faint traces of paint. And if there are faint traces of paint, there's going to be something there. And that something is most likely to be bits of bread. We don't know.
But the current strategy towards this painting, and I hate to dwell on it so much, but it fascinates me, seems to be to just let it be somewhat, because these halos have not been put back. There's still some little nail holes in some areas of the painting. This to be a very modern approach to conserving paintings, whereas in the 19th century, a great effort would have been made to make it seem as it would have been originally. Do you have any sort of final thoughts about this?
Yes, people have made all sorts of efforts over the years, and in the 19th century, they started restoring. They got interested from about the 1860s onwards and started restoring old icons and wall paintings. And fair enough, but mistakes were made. What do? Do you just take a bucket of water and slosh it on and hope that it's going to come out better? Then there are all sorts of solvents you can use, but those solvents may dissolve the paint worse than it would have been otherwise? Do you fill in a crack in the wood? It's very hard to know what to do. But modern restoration practice, you don't interfere with it any more than is absolutely necessary for the basic conservation.
So you call the Trinity icon the sort of pivotal artwork that Rublev made, but would this have been the case? Would it have been regarded as this masterpiece by him in his lifetime?
Yes.
Yes.
I think so. I think it was, because, as I say, it was painted in memory of St. Sergius. It was in a very prominent place in the icon screen, great icon screen of St. Sergius's monastery, which is still there, and his tomb stands in front of it. And even though the Trinity icon has been taken out, a very faithful reproduction of it is in place. And that means it was highly regarded. It was regarded as somehow summing up St. Sergius and his life's work and mission. And its fame wouldn't have lasted for over 100 years if it hadn't been very highly regarded in its time.
Rublev is regarded as maybe the inventor, as the magnificent feature of these churches that we call as high iconostasis, right?
Yes.
So could you maybe talk about some of the other works that we think he made, and maybe tell us about seeing them in person, because presumably you've gone to Russia to inspect some of them.
Yes. Well, the great monument of his work, in a sense, except it's not solely his work. He did it with his colleague Daniil. So we don't really know how to separate the two, but people have their own ideas, is the great cathedral in Vladimir, the Dormition of the Virgin in the Middle Russian city of Vladimir, which before Moscow arose was the center of Middle Russia. And a big cathedral dating back to the 12th century underwent various restorations and was burnt by the Tartars and so on. But it still stands, and there is still a substantial amount of wall painting by Andrey and Daniil remaining in it. Now, that has faded. The candle smoke has got at it, as you might say. It was never closed as a cathedral, even under Bolshevik rule, rather oddly. It remained open as an Orthodox church. And what you see in my book are quite a lot of illustrations that come from there, but they're much fainter. They haven't got the brilliance of color of the Trinity icon, and that's simply because of the conditions that they stayed under. But it is a magnificent place and gives a wonderful idea of the range of Andrey and Daniil. It's rather curious. Most of it is a Last Judgment series. Christ summoning the Last Judgment with trumpeters and so on. You get that in the West as well. Various the four beasts in the prophet Daniel that are diverse from one another. They're marvelous beasts, those. But at the same time, there are no scenes of hell. Maybe there were once, and maybe they've been lost, but I don't think so, actually. I think it is just the, as it were, rather cheerful beginnings of the Last Judgment.
Because when you think of the sort of depiction of the final judgment, the Last Judgment in the West, you think of Hieronymus Bosch, you think of those great German triptychs, where of course the painter revels the most in painting hell and all the beasts that emerge from it.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
It's a shame that would have been lost.
Well, yes, it would have been rather nice, but maybe they never did paint hell on the. I mean, not all the wall painting from that cathedral survives, so it's conceivable that there were scenes of hell. But judging by the normally rather cheerful and upbeat character of what we can judge to be Rublev's work, I'm not sure he would have been too happy with the scenes of hell, but that's all speculation.
Yes, and so if we look at those striking, you mentioned the colors. I mean, the coloration of his work is beautiful. And then if we compare that to the work of Theophanes the Greek, who uses these striking white highlights and whose style is very different, how could this man have been his teacher, his mentor? I
And
mean,
how could they have worked on the same commission?
exactly.
Again, we have to guess. Theophanes was older. He was a generation, maybe even 2 generations older, but he survived and led a team up to 1405. And he no doubt taught Rublev something, but Rublev was already in his 30s or 40s by then. So he'd had his own training. He did his own thing his own way. But it is wonderful speculation. I mean, some art historians who, to my mind, haven't thought too deeply about it, just said Theophanes sparked off the whole great period of the Russian icon. But it doesn't seem quite like that. He did have his influence, but not all that widespread an influence. And comparing the two of them is just a very interesting task. In fact, at one point, I thought Theophanes was going to take over my text altogether.
Maybe that's your next book.
Yeah, well, I think I can do without books.
You also mentioned the 14th century savior of the fierce eye in Moscow in the Kremlin Domitian Cathedral, which Rublev would have been familiar with, and which you saw in person, didn't you? And again, the way he depicts the same figure is very different.
Very different, yes. No, it's a bizarre image, but it's there. It still survives. You can see it.
One question that I had reading the book is that you mentioned that laymen who were painters in the 14th century, say, they could have been really well rewarded for their work.
Yeah.
But of course, if you're a monk, you won't be able to profit directly from your commissions. So why would a talented, sort of genius artist like Rublev, why would he have not just painted as a layperson? Why did he become a monk?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. I wish anybody knew the answer to that. All we know is that he was specifically mentioned as being a monk. And I think because, on the whole, that was unusual. Usually they were lay people. And it marks him out slightly out of the ordinary. I think you have to see Tarkovsky's film to get a picture of that.
Tarkovsky's film is so great too. So this is a 1966 movie, which is 3 hours long. And originally, well, you pointed out that he and his colleague were both called Andrey, and they were going to call it The Passion According to Andrey, right? A very ambiguous title. So let's talk a bit about, since you mentioned the movie, about Rublev's legacy. So in the centuries that followed, and also in the 20th century, how did people regard him and his work?
They knew his name from the chronicles. The chronicles were published and they knew his name. But in the 19th century, any art collector would say, oh, I've got a lot of Rublevs. They didn't. They just imagined it. But that's what happens, of course. But then it's rather interesting that Tarkovsky and his colleague Konchalovsky started self-identifying with Rublev. Lots of people who make films do the same. There was a talk on Radio 4 this morning about Ingmar Bergman and the Seventh Seal, and same sort of thing. Filmmakers get so wrapped up in what they do. And Tarkovsky certainly did, which means that all the other people who have different ideas get very cross with them. But one rather brilliant thing that Tarkovsky did was he never showed Rublev actually painting in the film. But right at the end, so we know the film is in black and white, and right at the end it switches into color for the last few minutes and shows the original or believed to be original icons in full color. And that is magnificent because it shows what was really important about this guy.
Yes, that is magnificent. It reminds me of this film Wings of Desire, which is a German film, and they have the same technique. Of course, this was filmed later, I think, by Wim Wenders, and it's black and white throughout the film, and I think at the end suddenly there's this burst of color. That was very clever. Now, given that you've also engaged with the same subject matter for a few years now, it begs the question, have you started to self-identify with Rublev?
Well, one tries to stand back from the subject, obviously, but no one gets closer and closer to it, of course. And one gets to admire him and what he did more and more as time goes on and understand his originality. We haven't mentioned that he probably undertook manuscript work, brilliant gospel called the Hitlervor Gospel, and that is actually as a manuscript, it is better preserved than anything else really by Rublev, and dazzling technique. It's pure Byzantine, late Byzantine. One doesn't assume it will be different from that, but there's plenty of variation possible within that particular sphere of influence, as it were. And I'd recommend anybody to turn to the illustration from the Gospel according to St. Matthew in there. See the image of St. Matthew as painted.
And you touched on something very significant there, because Rublev was a muralist, he was an icon painter, he was probably also involved in the making of manuscripts. So he was really a sort of very fully rounded artist. You're talking about the insights you gained writing the book. Could you maybe share one or two of the main insights that you've gotten? Like, in what way do you appreciate the artist better now that you've written the book?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because I never, as it were, underestimated him, but just didn't feel I knew enough to start pronouncing judgments. But it was quite an eye-opener to read what the two great art historians of the mid-20th century wrote about him. Alpart, of whom I quote a lot from, Lazarev, his sparring partner in a sense, and you get to truth rather better when you have two people sparring, as it were, with each other. That's probably like Rublev and Theophanes, by the way. But to read their very careful studies, even in Soviet conditions, which were not always favorable, but sometimes were, was quite an eye-opener. And I remember one of them, I think it's Lazarev, saying about Western art historians, talking about old Russian and Byzantine work, they read all we've written and then they go back and publish it as their own. Bit cynical, but there's something to that. And I must say, Alpart was brilliant and highly sensitive. And some of his work's been published in English, but probably not enough.
Now that your book is published, do you think there are parts of the book that aspects of Rublev's work that need more research? And if so, which part of his, what would yield the most, what would be the most fruitful?
You know about art history. you know that it never ends. And that fresh insights come up all the time.
Yes.
And by the way, we've got now Testament Trinity visible just behind my right ear. Do you see it?
Yes, well, that was one of the questions that's been sent in. I'll go to the questions in a minute, but first, we've almost finished this part of the show, but Lenin was a huge fan too, wasn't he? Can you maybe touch on how Rublev was received by the Soviets and by their leaders in particular, and by the artists working in the 20th century?
Well, they were the artists absolutely opened their eyes in 1919 when the first proper cleaning was done. It was actually sort of inadequately cleaned before then. The metal casing was taken off it. A single black and white photo was published, and people started writing articles about him on the basis of that one black and white photograph. So people were excited. They wanted something they needed something like that for the whole sort of art history, really, of the period. It was needed at the time, which needn't bother us particularly because that was then. But when the proper cleaning happened in 1919, then the magnificent priest and art historian and pioneer of various scientific subjects, actually, Florensky, his eyes were totally opened. He was a priest, as I say, in the Soviet period. He said, because Rublev's Trinity exists, God exists, which is taking things a bit far, but still, that was how it was for him. So thereafter, quite strong anti-religious campaign under Stalin in the 1930s. But these things weren't destroyed. They may have been, some of them, put into storage. Their captions would have been altered. And, there were various ways in which their religious content could be downplayed. But after the Second World War, then he bounced back gradually.
You were talking about how people's eyes were opened when the varnish was taken off and people could see the icons for what they really are. And in a similar way, your book has done that for a Western audience. At least it has done for me. You've opened my eyes to this interesting figure, this very talented artist, who, if you're not Russian, maybe, or not Eastern European, and you approach an artwork like this, it's very hard to understand because there's a lot of symbolism. But by reading your book, you get a really good sense of what these artworks, what their value is, and what they really mean. So,
well, I hope so.
Thank you for that. Now, before we go to the questions of the audience, I've got 7 questions which I ask each of my guests. And
I've had a great time pondering these. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, the first one is, what is one book that everyone should read?
Hero of Our Time by Lermontov. That may be a sufficient answer in itself, but written about 1840, you can say it's the beginning of Russian prose literature, and only a short book, less than 200 pages long. Not quite a novel, a string of stories, but one of the first real modern works of literature where which is dealing with a single character whose name is Pechorin. And in the end, he says, there are 2 people within me, one who lives in the fullest sense of the word, the other reflects and judges him. And the whole quite short book is an exposition of that.
Yes. Are there any other short stories or novels that you would recommend to someone who wants to explore Russian literature but has not done so before?
Well, anything by Gogol.
Okay.
Simple as that, yes.
Because I'm very
all
yes.
people with an individuality that makes them not Western European, but contributing to the Western European literary canon.
I'm personally very partial to Ivan Turgenev.
Yes.
Because he's a lovely writer too. Do you rate him highly?
Yes, up to a point. Of course, he gets mercilessly satirized by Dostoevsky in The Devils, but that's how literary life progresses. No, he is great, Turgenev, of course he is. His favorite place was Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, almost within sight of where I'm sitting.
I didn't know that. So the second question is, who's your favorite artist and why?
My favorite artist is somebody most people won't have heard of, but I've, in a sense, lived with his work for a long time. His name is Pavel Filonov, and he lived from 1883 to 1941, and he painted like nobody else. He had an inner vision of what he called analytic art, which is trying to display the smallest molecules of any subject that he took, and incredibly elaborate little dots of paint that were used. He would begin from one corner of the canvas and work his way up to the far corner without putting any original sketches on what he was painting on. He was a complete once-off and utterly dedicated. He famously would eat nothing but, well, he would eat potatoes and he would drink tea. That was it. And he made a sort of hermit of himself. But he founded quite a school. There were a lot of people who would have classed themselves as belonging to the school of Filonov. But he was a fire watcher in the siege of Leningrad. And his friends clubbed together to get him a coat to sit on the roofs of buildings, and he got pneumonia and died. So there we are. He's a legendary figure. I rather like legendary figures.
I had not heard of him before. Thank you. Of course, your wife, Alison, you're too humble to mention this, but your wife is a very talented artist as well. I saw some of her artworks. They're very good.
You're coming into the picture now. You're going to have to poke your face in.
No, but I can tell she is a really good.
Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, she is a very talented artist.
Yes. And I wondered, like, living together with an artist, has that given you a better insight in what it requires to make art?
Don't tell them what to do. Next question.
Because they'll get horribly cross. Okay. So leading on from the second question is, what's your favorite painting and why?
I wonder about this, and of course, if you're in the arts in any way, you have lots of favorite paintings, and they're your favorite children, and you can't sort of really discriminate between them. But in the end, it came to Manet, The Bar at the Folies Bergère.
At the Cornell Institute.
You must know it.
Well, yes.
Gallery in London.
Right, that's my alma mater. And
yes.
The reason why I went there is because Anthony Blunt was its director for almost 30 years.
And you went there?
I went there, yes, certainly.
God.
So yes. It's interesting because that painting now recently has a trigger warning applied to it to warn the viewer that there's a male gaze active. Because of course the woman is looking rather uncomfortably away, because presumably the person where we are standing, the beholder, is looking at her, scrutinizing her. So it's got a little warning next to it.
How funny. Well, that will go down in the history books as characteristic of our times. I thought it may be a trigger because of the legs of the acrobat up in the corner, but who knows? But the wonderful thing is the barmaid, you can't read her expression. It's rather like an icon in that way. And she looks so different from in front, from the mirror image behind. No, it's a painting that one can never lose sight of.
Exactly, and there have been like many feminist perspectives written on the painting, because actually it does put a woman and her psyche and the way she is observing the world quite central to a painting, to quite a monumental painting as well. So the next question is, what's your favorite piece of architecture? And I should tell the audience that in a sort of second double life that you have, you're very involved with the county where you live, Sussex, and you're an authority on its church architecture there. So I'm curious what your answer is going to be.
Well, it's not going to be a building in Sussex. I mean, there are some nice places in Sussex, and there are many buildings I'd pick out. I wouldn't want to pick out one rather than another at this point. But I should really say Santa Sophia in Constantinople. That's the obvious thing to say. But I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say the Pantheon in Rome, because in a way, Santa Sophia comes out of the Pantheon, though no art historians ever put it that way. But the Pantheon is just extraordinary, with its oculus on top, letting in the elements, letting in the light and the rain and everything. And the fact that it's been pretty much untouched for a couple of thousand years. It's extraordinary.
And of course, Santa Sophia is not a museum anymore. It is a mosque, and so accessible primarily or maybe only to Muslims. What do you think of this? Do you think it's good that it has returned to history, that it's alive again as a site of worship?
Well, I hope they don't mess it around, is all I can say. We sent our grandson there a month or two back to Istanbul. I said, take a good look and make sure that it's that it has remained as it was. But since he didn't know it as it was, it's rather hard to tell him that. But yes, it's a place I know well, but nobody really knows it absolutely inside out. It is so weird.
Question 5, what's a realization that really changed your life or career?
I've told you that before, and it's when I realized at school I didn't have to go on learning Greek at the hands of a sadistic headmaster who had just come in. You thought what? Oh, it doesn't matter. Anyhow, I mean, I think there were probably plenty of other moments like that, but I think that was the big realization. And I could learn German by myself through the poetry. I just picked up the Oxford Book of German verse, worked my way through it, taught myself.
Of course, you could argue that the sadism which you mentioned, it has a use because it makes everyone at a boarding school very uniform, like it happens in fraternities in Central Europe or America. And
yes.
If you think you're special, that will sort of be caned out of you, that idea. Like you'll be made to feel like everyone else. And this is what Winston Churchill objected to so much when he was at school. He wanted to be privileged. He wanted to be seen and valued as different and unique. So do you think maybe that education you had did shape you into the magnificent scholar that you are today?
Well, would that were the case, but I would say a magpie scholar. But anyhow, yeah, I don't know. It meant you could tread your own path. That was the thing. And shrug your shoulders. And, when I got a scholarship at Oxford, that headmaster never congratulated me. He was obviously quite cross that I wasn't still a classicist.
I see.
Anyhow, he's long dead now.
Presumably, because you've taught generations of students yourself, including Hilary Benn, I believe.
Including who?
Hilary Benn, Tony Benn's son.
Oh, yes. Yes, Hilary Benn.
Yes.
Yeah. Very
Presumably,
nice guy.
really? Oh, you remember teaching him?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I remember. I mean, I remember them all, but I can't put a face to all of them. But, you know, there aren't that many who do Russian. But the thing is, I taught mostly Russian literature and language over 40 years. So that's, on the whole, is what stuck. And it's very nice to get back to art.
Yes, and presumably you've not been very sadistic with them, but very understanding and very...
Well, I just want them to say what they want to say. That's the chief thing.
Sure. What is a quote that you really like?
If you get anything out of a student, you've done well.
Yes, as a student just a few years ago, I agree wholeheartedly. I think you've done rather well. I've heard people say, I've read things online sort of talking about how wonderful you were as a teacher. So that's
nice. Yeah.
Yes. What is a quote that you really like?
A quotation, yes. That, of course, was really hard, but especially having taught literature. But something by W.B. Yeats. I don't know why, but his every one of his great poems has got quotable lines on it. But I like to put on the gloomy mood occasionally, and of course, his 4 Ages of Man. It's only 8 lines long. 4 Ages of Man. You must know it. Yes. He with body waged a fight, but body won. He walks upright. Then he struggled with the heart. Innocence and peace depart. Then he struggled with the mind. His proud heart he left behind. Now his wars on God begin. At stroke of midnight, God will win. It's a wonderful 8-line poem. I think it was written by Yeats in old age, if I recollect. But I'm not going to stop with that because I'm going to give you a much shorter quotation, which is only 6 lines long. 6 words long, not even 6 lines, 6 words long. And this has a sort of modern resonance because it is the final words of the great Ukrainian wandering scholar called Grigory Skovoroda, who lived in the 18th century. And he was a very well-rounded scholar and knew Latin and Greek very well and wrote in them. And he refused to take up important positions. He just went round to the villages and taught in a sort of Socratic way. And stop me if you know all this already, but he finally wound up with a friend in a Ukrainian village, and after staying there for a bit, he went out each day, and it turned out he was digging his own grave, as a proper philosopher ought to do. And he wrote his own epitaph. And the epitaph, as I say, is only 6 words long. Mir lavil меня и не поймал, which means the world was always trying to catch me and never succeeded and never caught me. And you can't tell whether it's in Ukrainian or Russian or Slavic. He wrote in a sort of mixture of all 3. And to me, it's a great quotation that I've never forgotten since I first read it. And it shows how intermeshed the Russian and Ukrainian cultures are. Don't repeat that to a Ukrainian. They will say, no, that's absolute rubbish. But it's true.
Yes, they are brothers, and that's why it's so sad that they're fighting now. So I can see why you chose that poem. Why did you choose the one by Yeats?
Oh, and I could have chosen other things by Yeats too, later Yeats. Well, he had a way with words, that's all one can say. He did get the Nobel Prize.
Excellent.
His brother Jack was a great artist, by the way. Everybody has forgotten Jack Yeats, but you go to Dublin and he's magnificently represented.
Good recommendation. Yeah, everyone go to Dublin and look at those paintings up. Who is the most, this is the final question that I have for you, who's the most brilliant or interesting person you've ever met? And you have had a long life, you've met famous Russian poets and writers, you've studied with amazing people, so I'm really curious who you're going to say.
Yeah, I met various famous people at one time or another, usually just to shake hands and say hello. Even John F. Kennedy, hello, Robin, good to meet you. That was the conversation. But
well, you've got to tell me now, like when should we?
But the far the most interesting figure of that respect that I met was Isaiah Berlin, and I knew him over several years, one way and another. Just I was a student at Oxford and came across him and it sort of kept up. And what impressed me was when he started talking about the way he lectured, because he was famous. He'd never submitted a script when he lectured on the BBC. He just fluently did it straight off. And he said, "You don't know how difficult this is for me to do. I first write out a whole essay, then I concentrate it to a few words." And he said, he came and talked to our university when we were talking about Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov once. He said, "Oh, come, don't tell anybody I'm there." He said, "If I have to make a public performance," he raised his hand like this and showed his bent fingers, said, "The doctor has told me that it's from public lecturing that I've got these fingers like this." But also he was rather oddly, although he was so famous, but he was a very straightforward and humble person too. So there you are.
I had no idea that you knew him. Was this a kind of friendship you had with him?
No, I mean, he was way older than I was, but he was a teacher all his life, and he was very good with students. I think I was the president of the Russian Society or something and asked him to talk or to do something or other. He's the same generation as Obolensky and the rest. I mean, these people, they were famous, they were fellows of All Souls or Christ Church or whatever, but they would always put themselves out for students and trust students' judgments too. Extraordinary.
Yes, and there's a very nice tradition in England of sort of very notable people doing this. So speaking to audiences for free, being very free with their time and kind with the way you're being with me now. Is you've just given me an hour more of that, of your time, sort of explaining the most wonderful things to me and the audience, and we really appreciate it. So from the audience, speaking about the audience, we've got a few questions. There's a comment here saying, "How wonderful to learn more about the art from this region and period by such an eminent scholar through this channel."
I'm very suspicious of the words eminent scholar. I am the person who happens to have delved into it, put it that way. But it's very kind of whoever said it.
You're like the gentleman you just mentioned. You are very modest. And then I have a question from a girl called Lily. She asks, "Can you ask Robin what the icon is in the background? Can you maybe tell us about the icon?"
Yes, I can. It's the three angelic figures of the Old Testament Trinity. It's probably a 17th century icon, so it's quite old actually. The wood is bowed, you know, the wood on which it's painted, because there's paint on one side and the other side moisture gets to, and that makes the wood bow. There's nothing you can do about it. You put struts in the back, and it seems as if they're working, but they're not. And it's rather nice. And it's in a sort of slight depression, which was characteristic of early icons, with a sort of a rim round it. And it was, I was a student in Moscow in the first winter I was there, and I was simply admiring the icon screen in the Annunciation Cathedral. And another youngish guy came along, sidled up to me and said, "You're interested?" Yes, I'm interested. And he got into conversation and said, "I've got some icons." And in the end, we made a further meeting, and he sold me 3 icons. Except as a student, I didn't have any money, so I flogged an old suit that I had with me, and various things, and my monthly income, and I gave them all to him, and he gave me these 3 icons, and one of them, far the best, was this. It had a big split down the middle. I don't know if you can tell from there, but when I got back to London, I got a quite elderly icon painter to fill in the split in the wood, not so as to deceive the eye, but just, you know, to make the thing whole. And that was great. This is very Russian. I'd gathered up all the money I could, stay with the suit and so on, and from giving it to him rather, and he took it to a second-hand shop, and he said, "We'd better go to a restaurant and celebrate this." So we went to a restaurant. He had various of his friends, all came round. He must have spent every penny that I gave him on that evening. I've still got a little liqueur glass that he shoved in my pocket at the end. And I only met him once more, many months later, walking down Gorky Street in Moscow. He stopped and he looked at me and he said, "I haven't managed to sell that old suit yet." It's only words. So one lived a strange life in that place at that time. But I brought them back. Nice to have them.
Amazing. And you had them ever since.
Yeah.
It's funny because the Dutch-German side of me says, but no, that is not long-term thinking, what he's doing, spending all the money. But then my Persian side thinks that's so generous and that's so warm, and that's really a nice aspect of Russian culture.
Well, yes, they're fairly spontaneous, I think I can say.
Yes.
Certainly well.
So anyone who's trying to send in messages or questions, you've got to do so right now. I've got one other question here by Rachel, and she says, these artists used lapis lazuli in Western Europe. These were imported through Venice. How did they do this in Russia?
A very good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, because later on, lapis lazuli came through Venice. Came from Far Eastern trade, and that is sort of straightforward in a sense, and that's why a lot of medieval art, later medieval art, they use it, and they don't use it in large quantities because it's a pretty special stuff, but you find it on the Wilton diptych or whatever. But how did it get to Russia? And I think the only answer is through the Tartars. The Tartars were beginning to encourage.
Don't forget that I got a whole lot
of pigments.
Pigments, and actually used them to paint icons.
Yes. Alison, by the way, has got various pigments, some of which I dug out of the green sand rock in Sussex, but others that we got in Leningrad.
What's his name?
Yeah, we picked them up in Leningrad, picked them up in Esfahan, actually.
Esfahan, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that as a Persian that you picked that up in Isfahan. That's great.
Yes,
Well,
it would be. Well, I wondered about your name. It sounds Persian to me, but there we
well,
are.
it is Persian. So you went to Persia at some point then?
Yeah, we
What-
went with
yeah.
friends quite some years ago. I mean, like I would say 15 years ago, something like that. And the atmosphere was very relaxed, but it isn't relaxed now. But in Isfahan, it was terrific. I mean, the great, that great square is just unbelievable. And the market. We bought a nice rug there, and it was a rug small enough. It was a camel rug, fold up and put in your luggage. And after about 20 minutes, the shopkeeper hurried up and said, "I'm very sorry, I can't take your Visa card." I can't. I mean, he's very trusting to let me go away with the rug, and it was rather hard because, of course, the entire Visa and MasterCard business was in American hands, and they were already had sanctions against Iran. And I said, "Well, surely you can do something," because I didn't have any cash or enough cash. And he said, "It's all right. I'll send it through to our office in Dubai." They had their ways.
We do have our ways. That's right.
Yes.
Maybe your next book should be about Russian-Persian relations, or this very interesting area in the Caucasus where, of course, the Russian and the Persian empires overlapped.
Absolutely, yes. And that trip to I don't even call it Iran, I call it Persia, because that's what it is. That was very memorable, and not just Isfahan, but Yazd and other places. So it was, one of the most interesting places I've ever been to.
Which was?
Our Persian trip.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, did you ever talk to Russians about Iran, and like what was their opinion or their view on the country?
No, I never did talk, so I don't know. Though I've got a friend who, slightly younger than me, I'm glad to say, who has just produced a huge book on Russia and China, the relations. I mean, it could be that Persia occasionally pops up, I don't know, but you wouldn't have thought there was any contact between Russia and China particularly, but there was, and dating right back to the first treaty in 1680s. And in the case of both Russia and China, it was the first treaty that either had made with a foreign power. Because you didn't, back in the 17th century, you didn't believe in making treaties. You could make agreements, but treaties imply that you were on a lower level. So Treaty of Nerchinsk, which cemented Russo-China relations for quite a long time along the Amur River, and was concluded in 2 extinct languages. One was Latin and the other was Old Manchu. The Qing dynasty had just come into China, and they weren't sort of totally happy where they were. But that's one of the oddities of history. It took the Russian delegation 18 months to get there. Those were the days when travel was travel.
If you send me the title of the book later, I'll put a link under the YouTube video. Now, yes, I would like to thank Professor Milner-Gulland for coming onto the show. It's been a very lively, interesting discussion. I've certainly learned a lot. So thank you for that. Is there anything you're working on at the moment? And where can my viewers find you and your work?
Well, I think I shall take a deep breath for the rest. I was going to say for the rest of the summer, but I think I've missed most of the rest of the summer. But no, we've got various things that we're doing, and I certainly haven't got another book going at the moment. But yeah, it's quite nice to take a rest sometimes.
Right.
And
do you have any ideas for future books?
well, if I'm asked to do something, I tend to do it. And for reaction books who published this, I've done translations for them and so on. And that's been great.
Yes.
I enjoy translating.
You enjoy translating?
I enjoy translating simply because it's impossible, but that's the fun of it.
Yes, and your book, Andrey Rublev, The Artist and His World, it's one of the greatest books I've read this year. It gives a great insight in a region and a culture that is very undervalued in the West. So I recommend everyone to go buy that book. It's great.
Well, it's lovely that you say that, and it's quite short.
It is very short. It's about 130 pages, plus an index and everything.
Plus a few things, bits and pieces. So, no, I said what I wanted to say in it, and I didn't think I wanted to pad it out any further.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Robin, for coming.
Well, thank you, Cheyenne. Yes, great.
Next Monday.
Sketchbook or one of the many.
Yes. Well, I hope we didn't bore the listeners so they're all gone away.
I don't think so. No, the listeners have kind of doubled, so there are twice as many listeners now as at the beginning. So you've done the exact opposite. They can't get enough of you. That's why. And now, next Monday on the 25th of September, I'll be talking to two authors of a new book called The World of Art. And so if you've ever thought about investing in art, this is a great talk for you to tune into, because we're going to talk about what should you look at when you are on the financial market and you're trying to make a good investment. So that's going to be a lot of fun and very informative as well.
Who are the authors, do you say?
The authors, I'll send you a link. I'll send you a link.
Yeah, send me a link. That's the best way.
I think you might enjoy it as well. So you'll be taught how to buy with your head as well as your heart. Now, before I say goodbye, I'll give the final word to you, Robin. Is there anything you want to say? Any sort of closing remarks on the topic or our talk? Please feel free.
Well, it's a well-known fact that in a lecture, you can only get 1 point across. Which that point is going to be, one can't guess. But if you get 2 points across, then you've done brilliantly. So we'll just have to wait and see.
I think you've got many points across in this conversation. So
I hope people remember the world was catching me and never caught up. That's another way of translating that. That's a delightful thing.
That's very clever. So thank you for that, and see you all next Monday. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Well done.